Shri Gurubhyo Namaha. We welcome to Online Teaching Academy Ekalive, Standard 11. Subject Biology. In the last class, we have seen about the different types of inflorescence. Now, we will look into the structure of a flower. We all know that the flower is a reproductive part of the plant, and it is colorful, and it is nothing but a modified condensed shoot. So, a flower is nothing but a modified condensed reproductive shoot, and the growth of the flower shoot is determinate. When you see the flower is having 4 different whorls. You will find in this picture, and already in the lower classes you all would have dissected the flower. And when you see that, this is the stalk on which the flower is born, and here this stalk of the flower is called as pedicel. So, this is the stalk of the flower which you call it as a pedicel, and a small leaf like structures from where the pedicel arise. This is what we call it as bract. So, a small leaf-like structures from which the flower is arising on the pedicel or at the base of the flower or the base of the pedicel, you call it as a bract. If a flower is having a bract, then you call such flowers as bracteate, you will call it as bracteate flower. If the flower doesn't have a bract, you use a letter E in front of this, then it becomes E bracteate. And in between the bract and the flower, you will find in some of the flowers a leaf-like structures, and these are called as bracteoles. And if a flower is having a bracteole, you call it as bracteolate flower. If a flower doesn't have a bracteoles, then you call it as ebracteolate flower. Then you know that these floral parts, like what you call it as the colorful part which helps in pollination, attracting the insects, you call this as corolla. And these green parts, what you call it as a calyx. And you will find the male part, this is the male part, which we call it as stamen. And this female part is what we call it as pistil. And this male part, either you can use another term, what you call it as androecium. And the female part is otherwise known as gynoecium. Now, so a flower is having 4 whorls. That is, the outer whorl is what we call it as the green color part, which is what we call it as a calyx, and it is a whorl. You will find that each member of this calyx, we call it as sepal. And this, the second whorl, the innermost whorl, what we call it as the corolla, it is a whorl, and each member of this corolla, you call it as petal. And then the male part, the androecium, having stamen. The stamen will have, you will find this is the anther, this is the anther, and this is what we call it as a filament. You call it as a filament. This portion is called as filament. And this is gynoecium, what we call it as a pistil, and this pistil will have a, this is what we call it as a stigma, and this is the style, and this is the ovary. And all these floral parts are borne on a base, this flattened portion, what we call it as thalamus. You call it as thalamus, or otherwise you can call it as receptacle. The other word you can also call it as torus. So, These floral whorls are borne on a flattened condensed axis. What we call this as thalamus. You can call it as a receptacle or torus. So, if the flower is having all these 4 whorls, then you call that flower as complete flower, you will call it as. If a flower is having all these 4 whorls, that is the calyx, the corolla, androecium and gynoecium, then you call it as a complete flower. If a flower is not having any of this whorl, then you call that flower as incomplete flower, you call it as. Incomplete flower. Now, when we look into the sex of the flower, that is the flower sex, whether the presence or absence of androecium and gynoecium, we have a bisexual flower, that is a flower contains both androecium and gynoecium. Then, if we say an imperfect flower, that is what we call it as an unisexual, where the flower contains only one essential whorl it will have, then you call it as an imperfect or unisexual flower. In this we will find a staminate flower. A staminate flower means a flower which is having only stamen, that is the androecium alone, then we call it as a staminate flower. If a flower has only a gynoecium, if a flower is having only gynoecium, that is we call it as a pistillate flower, we call it as only with gynoecium alone, you call it as a pistillate flower. If a flower is having all, that is the bisexual flower as well as unisexual flower, then you call it as polygamous, you will call it as. So, either the flower may be unisexual, bisexual or polygamous. You can see the picture, then it will become very clear. So, when you look around the flowers, you can study in detail and can identify that the flower either it is unisexual, bisexual or polygamous. So, in this picture you can find here, this is the flower where you will find bisexual flower, that is the male part is there and the female part is there. Here you will find only one sex is there, this is an androecium, so you call this flower as a staminate flower, you call it as. And this flower is only having a gynoecium, so you call this as pistillate flower, you will call it as. And here you will find this as a monoecious plant, you will call it as, where you will find on the plant, you will find the female flower as well as the male flower on the same plant. Here in this you will find, this is dioecious, where you call it as in one plant you will find only the female flowers and in another plant you will find the male flowers. Then here it is what we call it as bisexual flower, that is polygamous. You will find this is staminate, pistillate as well as bisexual. You will find in mango. So, this is what we call it as polygamous, you will call it as. So, you will find polygamous in musa and the bisexual in monoecious plants you will find in coconut. And here dioecious plants, that is both male and female flowers are present on separate plants, which you will find in papaya and palmyra. This is what we call it as dioecious. So, you should know about monoecious and dioecious. Now, when we talk about the symmetry of the flower, when you take a flower and when you cut it, whether you can cut the flower into 2 equal halves in more than one plane, then you call that as radial symmetry, you will call it as. You can see here, you can cut the flower in this angle into 2 equal halves, either any angle, in many angles you can cut into 2 equal halves, then you call that flower as having a radial symmetry and you call it as actinomorphic, you call it as actinomorphic. So, if a flower shows 2 mirror images when cut in any plane or radius through the center, then you call this as actinomorphic, you will call it as. You will find in hibiscus and datura. Hibiscus is the shoe flower. If you can cut the flower only in one plane into 2 equal halves, then you call that as zygomorphic, you will call it as, or bilateral symmetry, you will call it as. if you are not able to cut the flower into two equal halves at any plane, then you call it as asymmetric, you will call it as. So, with this symmetry, we can study the flowers as actinomorphic, zygomorphic or asymmetric. Now, when you talk about the arrangements, you can find that the arrangements may be whorl or spiral and all, but we will look into the other part, children, here. Now, here we will talk about this now. Now, how many floral paths are there in a whorl? You said that the flower is having 4 whorls. That is, the outer whorl is called as calyx. The inner whorl, that is the inner one, is what you call it as corolla, then androecium and gynoecium. And how many numbers are there in these floral whorls? Based on that, what you call it as merosity, you call it as. So, the flower may be having same number if it is present, you call it as isomerous. That is, presence of the same number of perianths and different whorls of a flower. Either the 5 sepals, 5 petals are there, then you call it as isomerous. If the flower is having, if you see, if they have a different numbers, then you call it as anisomerous, you will call it as. Anisomerous is if the flower is having two different numbers. In calyx you will find a different number and in corolla you find different number, then you call it as anisomerous. And if the floral paths are in multiples of 2, 2 or multiples of 2, you call it as bimerous. And trimerous is where you will find 3 or multiples of 3, and you will find an allium. And this is the characteristic feature of monocots. Like you have studied, when we have studied in vegetative morphology, children, we said, started from the root system and we studied, we said that the taproot is the characteristic feature of a dicot, fibrous root is the characteristic feature of monocot. And when we have studied the arrangement of venation there, we said that the dicots will have what kind of venation? Reticulate venation, yes. And in monocots you will find parallel venation. And again when you talk about the flowers and how many numbers are there, here if the flower is having 3 or multiples of 3, you call it as a trimerous flowers, and this is the characteristic feature of a monocot. And if the flower is having floral paths in 4 or multiples of 4, which you will find in brassicum, then you call it as tetramerous. And if it has 5 or multiples of 5, you call it as pentamerous. And this you will find in hibiscus. And in dicots, either you will find that the flower may have either 4 or multiples of 4, 5 multiples of 5, either it may be tetramerous or pentamerous. So, trimerous you will find in monocots, tetramerous and pentamerous you will find in dicots. Now, when we look to the calyx, we said that the calyx is nothing but the outermost whorl, which is green in color. You can find that this is the calyx what you were talking about. Now, on this we will find that the corolla is present. So, this calyx when you talk about, what does the calyx does? The calyx protects the bud, the flower in bud stage, and it is the outermost whorl. And this calyx normally it is green in color. And this calyx, if you see that we said that this is the calyx which you call it as a whorl, and each member you call it as what? Sepal. You call it as a sepal. And these sepals either they may be free or united. So, the sepals, you can find that the sepals may be free or they may be united. Based on that you call with the two different terms. If the sepals are free, you use a term called as polysepalous, you call it as. if the sepals are free or free, then you call it as polysepalous. If they are united, if they are free, you call it as polysepalous, and if they are united, you call it as gamosepalous, you will call it as. You call it as gamosepalous. So, you will find here the calyx. You can see that these are the calyx which are there, the green color parts which you can see. And here either it depends upon, we were talking about polysepalous, the flowers with distinct sepals you will find in brassica where they are free, or they may be, here you will find united, it may be, then you call it as syncepalous or gamosepalous, you will call it as. And then the duration of the floral paths. What is the function of the calyx? We said that the calyx is protecting the flower in a bud condition. After the pollination process and fertilization, the calyx and corolla will wither off. Sometimes the calyx will remain after fertilization takes place also. Then depending upon the duration, how long the calyx is there with the development of the fruit, we can study under different headings. What we call it as, here you will find, either the calyx may be caudicous or fugacious, you will call it as. That is the calyx that withers or falls during the early development stage of the flower. Then you call it as caudicous, which you will find in papaver. And the other one, what you call it as deciduous. What is deciduous? If the calyx falls after the opening of the flower, you call it as deciduous. And then if the calyx persists and continues to be along with the fruit and forms a cup at the base of the fruit, which you will find in brinjal, you call it as persistent. And the last kind of calyx is what you call it as acrescent, you call it as. This calyx persistent, it is persistent, and it also grows along with the fruit and encloses the fruit either completely or partially, which you can find in physalis or palmyra. This you call it as acrescent. So, depending on the duration of the calyx, either you can say that it may be caudicous, C-A-D-U-C-O-U-S, caudicous, or you call it as fugacious. And the second one you call it as deciduous, that falls after the opening of the flower, or it may be acrescent, A-C-C-R-E-S-C-E-N-T, that is persistent along with the fruit, then you call it as acrescent. Now, and the shape of the calyx, if you see children, the calyx, you can see that it is of different forms, but we will look about the next part, what you call it as the next whorl, what we call it as a corolla. So, corolla is the whorl, and each individual member you call it as a petal, and we all know that they are beautifully colored and various colors you will find in the flowers. And what do? It displays the flower and it attracts the pollinators. Now, again here when we were talking about, either the petals may be distinct, they are free, okay, what you call it as polypetalous, you will call it as. If they are fused, that is the word which we were talking about there. In sepals we said that either it may be polysepalous or gamosepalous. If the petals, when you talk about, if the petals are free, then you call it as polypetalous. If the petals are fused, then you call it as gamopetalous. And you will find in hibiscus, and if the petals are fused, you will find in datura. Okay, then again here, the shapes of the corolla are of various forms. We will not study in detail here children, we will go to the next part there. This papilionaceous corolla, that is the corolla, we will study when we talk about, or we will look now here, what is this papilionaceous corolla? This you will find in Clitoria ternata. Okay, the sankupu, what you call it as the purple flower or the white flower which you find. In this you will find that in this picture, if you see, you will become very familiar, children. You can take the flower, and dissect and see, children, so that you will become more familiar with this kind of corolla. This is what you call it as a papilionaceous corolla. You would have seen this flower, I think so. And here if you see that, this is the large petal, children. This is a large petal which is present. This petal is what we call it as vexillium, you will call it as, or a standard petal you will call it as. And these two lateral petals which are there, what you call it as alea, and this you call it as carina. Okay, these are the wings, and inner side you will find two boat shaped petals which are fused. You call this as carina. And this arrangement of the flower, you call it as papilionaceous corolla, you will call it as. So, here when we were talking about perianth, we said that the perianth is nothing but undifferentiated calyx and corolla. Either if it is fused, you call it as gamophilous. If they are free, you call it as polyphilous. The arrangement of the calyx and corolla in the bud condition, what we call it as estivation or as estivation, we will see in the next class.